Research ethics. So we're going to go over the key points for research ethics for survey design. And the two key areas that we'll cover will be informed consent, and we'll also look at issues about protection of data. So data security, which would involve data encryption and making sure that the data that we do collect in a survey is not that is secure. Just to talk about research ethics, the picture to the left is taken from the Willowbrook Institution. It was an institution for the developmentally delayed, and it was became infamous basically for the neglect of the children who resided at that institution, and also for the unethical research that took place there. Many of the children were purposely infected with hepatitis to allow researchers to study treatments for hepatitis. Parents gave consent, but it was putting the children's obviously putting the children's lives at risk, and was quite dangerous and clearly unethical. And the picture to the right is from a movie about the Tuskegee individuals who formed were members of a research study that I'll talk about in a bit. It was a study that looked at the long-term effects of venereal disease. We've through our history, we've had a very interesting perspective on terms of human participants in research. E. Slauson in the late 1800s. He was the Bill Nye the Science Guy of his era, or in Canada, the David Suzuki. And he's quoted as saying, "A human life is nothing compared with a new fact in science. The aim of science is the advancement of human knowledge at any sacrifice of human life. We do not know of any higher use we can put a man to." And he firmly believed that people could be, against their own free will, forced into dehumanizing and dangerous studies that put the individuals who participated in the research, put their lives at risk. And that was a fairly common belief at the time. George Bernard Shaw was the person who came up with the notion of using people as guinea pigs. And as he's quoted, "The folly which sees in the child nothing more than the vivisector sees in a guinea pig, something to experiment on with a view to rearranging the world." I direct you on Blackboard. There's a section on the abuse of children in research. There's a short research article that covers some of the examples of the research, unethical research that was undertaken with children as participants through recent history. And there's a couple of videos. There's a video on the Willowbrook case, and there's also a case summary of the case Jesse Gelsinger, which I will talk about in a few minutes. So, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study. The study was initially funded by a rich philanthropist who put the money into the study. He funded the study, but then study was planned in the late 1920s. But then the depression hit. That person who was funding the study lost his wealth and could not afford it anymore. And the study was undertaken by the National Public Health Service Office, and U.S. Public Health Service Office out of Washington. It was a prospective study, and the purpose of the study was to investigate the effects of untreated syphilis on living subjects. They targeted Tuskegee in Alabama, which is a poor area of the states where the individuals who were black did not have access to adequate health care, dental care. And the researchers came in with nurses and doctors and offered the residents free access to dental care, routine health checkups, and treatment for minor health conditions. But while these people were getting treated, they thought they were getting health care provided to them. The individuals were purposely infected with syphilis. and so they were made syphilitic, and they were not told this. This was in the 1930s, and until up through to the 1970s, the researchers continued to observe the individuals who are infected with syphilis to see the effects of venereal disease on individuals. Obviously, the individuals would develop symptoms associated with syphilis. They would go to a clinic or a doctor's office or a nurse, and the nurse and medical staff were purposely told to tell them to not divulge to them that they actually had syphilis. So they were observed for the effects upon their health of being syphilitic. The study was ended in the 1970s. There was an investigation into how this happened because of the ethics associated with extremely unethical research. And John Heller, who was the director of the Venereal Diseases Unit at the Public Health Service, who headed the study, was the last person to manage that study, is quoted as saying, "The men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. Clinical material, not sick people." So this ties back to East Lossing, the Bill Nye guy from the late 1800s, in terms of how he considered humans in the context of human participation in research. And to this day, there's many issues, many examples of this type of behavior and attitude. Okay, another example. This is research ethics. Severe hypothermia. So you're going to be experiencing winter soon if you haven't experienced winter for the first time yet. It gets very cold. And in this area, people who like outdoor activities, many of them will own snowmobiles, and the snowmobiles will be used on frozen lakes and rivers, which is actually really dangerous. I would really avoid doing it. It is just not safe to take snowmobiles out on unmarked trails in this area. Pressure cracks. If there's currents, there'll be thin ice. And throughout the winter, every couple of weeks, there'll be in the news a report of a snowmobiler who's been killed or has gone through the ice and either drowned or suffered, was rescued but was experiencing hypothermia. Okay, so severe hypothermia, which is horrible, and this core temperature of the body going below 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Shivering, until the shivering finally ceases, muscle rigidity develops, skin becomes pale, pupils dilate, pulse rate decreases. At 90 degrees, the body shuts down all peripheral blood flow, reducing breathing rate and heart rate. At 86 degrees, the body is in a state of metabolic icebox. The person looks dead, but actually is still alive. Frostbite leading to gangrene in the hands and feet. This is the complications after having survived hypothermia. Inflammation of the pancreas, fluid in the lungs, pneumonia, kidney failure, and heart irregularities. And there'll be cases of people from severe hypothermia go into some odd psychotic states. It's not uncommon for people experiencing hypothermia to actually strip off their clothes, even though they're actually freezing. So it's very horrible. Hypothermia is incredibly painful, and obviously is very dangerous. Well, when this happens, so they say they rescue a snowmobiler from the ice, what do? Well, they have to treat them. And the treatment for the longest time was gradual rewarming. It was thought you have to warm them up fairly gradually. If you warm someone who's hypothermic, if you warm them up too fast, they'll it'll just put another shock in their system and could kill them. So that was the common belief. Researchers at the University of Minnesota found research that had been unpublished, and the research, which was methodologically was very well designed, and the results from the research showed that the best treatment in most cases for hypothermia is not slow, gradual rewarming, but is rapid rewarming. You warm them up as reasonably and as fast as you can, and that's what the research showed. Now, the research was completed by Dr. Sigmund Rascher. So the ethics issue here is Sigmund Rascher was a Nazi who worked with prisoners of war and victims held in concentration camps in Germany. And he basically completed barbaric research. And the barbarism of his research was he would purposely freeze people, and many of those people would be frozen to death. But as they were being placed into a frozen state and going through the stages of hypothermia, he did treatments to see what was most effective. And it was important to the Nazis because there were many of their bomber pilots and fighter pilots were being shot down over in the North Sea or in the English Channel, and the waters were relatively cold, and they would experience hypothermia. And the victims were concentration camp people held in the concentration camps, prisoners of war, documentation from survivors who escaped after the end of the Second World War, who were part of the experiments, gave statements to the cruelty and the pain that they experienced as being victims of this research. And the research was put into the records of the war trial, the war trials at the end of the Second World War, and the research sat unread for many years as basically a court document. And no researchers are really interested in it because the consensus was that the people who were doing these barbaric forms of research were basically basically sociopaths and not very well trained in research, just doing very cruel things, simply in the name of cruelty. When the researchers from the University of Minnesota read the research, they realized, yes, a lot of the research was really bad, but the research that Rascher did was actually very well designed. Then the ethics question is, what do you do with that research? The research was acquired through barbaric, unethical means, but if you use the research, you will save lives. So that was the moral dilemma that the researchers in the medical community faced once the research had been rediscovered. And the research was eventually used. It took a lot of dialogue and with representatives from the groups who were victims of the research and victims during the Second World War. And the two sides of it were that if you did allow the research to be used, it may motivate others to complete similar forms of barbaric research. And the other side of that was people's relatives died as a result of this research, and to, in a sense, bring some good to their suffering, the research should be used to save lives and bring good out of evil. And I don't think there's really there's not a right or wrong answer to this moral dilemma, but the research was eventually used. There's a video on Jesse Gelsinger. I won't get into it in detail here. Jesse Gelsinger gave his life as a participant in a research trial study on genetic therapy. The video gives a solid explanation of what Jesse went through and the implications of the discovery of the improper procedures that were used that were basically incredibly unethical. But I'll leave that for you to watch that video. It's on it's with the research on the vulnerable populations, in particular children. Okay. So research ethics, in terms of in Canada, internationally, a moral imperative, respect for human dignity. An ethic of research involving human subjects should include two essential components: the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends, the morally acceptable means to those ends. So the first one, the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends, means that research that brings betterment to the human condition is to be supported. Research that denigrates populations and is meant to inflict suffering or discrimination upon individuals or groups is not to be done. The morally acceptable means to those ends means that the procedures that are used in the research must respect the rights and also then safety of individuals who are recruited to participate in studies or in a study. The Canadian Panel on Research Ethics, which is PRE, is responsible for the management of research policies and procedures in Canada for public sector funded research. So any institution, a hospital, college, university that receives federal grant funding for research is required to meet the conditions as set out by PRE for the ethical treatment of human participants in research. And that includes funding from the three major grant funding agencies under the direction of the federal government. And Georgian College has to and does meet the requirements in terms of its procedures for the review and approval of research in terms of the ethical standards that the research must meet. Okay, the core principles for research ethics is the respect for human dignity and to protect the multiple and interdependent interests of the person from bodily to psychological to cultural integrity. So key thing is respect for free and informed consent for a survey. That's critically important. Respect for vulnerable persons. That is critically important if your research involves participants who may be considered to be vulnerable. Respect for privacy and confidentiality. That's key in terms of ensuring that you maintain a person's privacy and confidentiality. And we'll talk about that in the context of data storage. Respect for justice and inclusiveness. Just examples of justice and inclusiveness. Medical research in terms of pharmaceutical research on the testing of drug treatments. Years ago, the participants in drug trials were males, typically white males. There were no females or women involved in the trials, or people of color, or people from different groups. The pharmaceutical industry only broadened or made more diverse or improve the diversity of its recruitment pool through federal legislation in the U.S. They were basically told they had to do it. And any research is the balancing of harms and benefits, which a lot of this you will have covered in the core tutorial that you completed, and I know you've talked about it or will talk about it in qualitative research. Okay. For your survey for this course, you have to make sure that you cover the elements of informed consent. And those are listed here. So when you submit your survey for this course, that survey must include all of these elements of informed consent. And we'll go through it. There's examples for you to read. I won't go through them in any detail here. But this is the article on ethics with research in children you can look at. This is an example I will post for you to read. I've listed all the key points that are included in informed consent. This is one of in terms of your contact with a potential participant or respondent to your survey. This is one of the first pieces of information that you will give them and ask them to review before they make their decision as to whether or not they want to participate in your study. I'm not going to go through it in detail here. I ask that you do it on your own. I've highlighted the key points that must be covered. This is from an approved consent form for a study that was completed by RAP students last year. The one point I want to raise, this is a request for contact. Sometimes you'll ask them before you even give them the survey if you want to follow up. This is for a mixed methodology, if for an interview, for example, or if they want to participate and to be contacted for a follow-up interview. So in this case, the key thing I wanted to raise here is the notion that When you ask them to sign anything, you're not asking them to sign off a contract saying, yes, I have agreed to participate in the study and my signature is documentation that I have agreed. No, that is not the purpose of having a person sign a consent form. The purpose of you having a person sign the consent form is acknowledgement that the person has read the consent form and is stating to you that they understand what is stated in terms of the requirements for informed consent. So they know what they're agreeing to. That's all that you're asking them to sign to. So it's your verification that they've read it and they've understood it. You're not asking them saying, yes, I have agreed to participate in the study, and by signing this document, that is my consenting to be a participant. No. They're only signing off that they've read it and understand it. It's a subtle point, but it's a critically important point. Now, it's important in terms of procedure, and I often think of this as being the chain of custody in law. So, chain of custody is when evidence is collected, the maintenance and storage and transportation of that evidence has to be fully documented, and it's documented to say that the evidence has been maintained and has not been in any way corrupted. If there's a chain if there's a break in the chain of custody for a piece of evidence, where there's a point where they don't know what happened or what came of that evidence, like sometimes it'll be say for example, a police officer took it home and left it in there in the trunk of their car. That's a break in the chain of custody. That evidence then becomes inadmissible because it could be contaminated because they haven't properly documented the transportation and movement and collection and storage of that evidence. It's very similar in survey research. Every piece of contact you have with a potential respondent has to be clearly documented, and the procedure has to be consistent and applied in a consistent manner, meaning that when you say you're going to say something to the respondent, that has to be documented. So you need all of the elements of informed consent included in your conversation. Now, there's a number of ways that you can contact someone to have them complete a survey. It could be an intercept survey. You walk up to them and ask them, would you be willing to complete the survey? So, for example, the one for the ESL program, the researchers went into the classroom and they asked people, would you be interested? They gave them the consent. They read the consent out to them. They gave them the consent. They signed off if they were interested, and they signed off on it. And then they filled out a paper survey. Or they could have, they also had, I didn't show it here, but they had a paper survey. If you're doing an if you're doing an online survey, for example, you can send an email invitation. So that's your first contact with the potential participant, is an email that you send them. Well, in your survey that you submit for this course, I need to see if your survey is designed that way, in terms of you have complete flexibility in terms of how you do it, because it is a mock proposal or mock survey. You have to document what your email invitation is, and I'll show you an example in a sec. Or another means of recruiting people is through a poster advertisement. Now, you can have a poster advertisement that's like something that's posted on a website. It could be something that's posted on billboards, say around Georgian College. You can also have a poster, your poster advertisement could send them directly to the survey, or your poster advertisement could send them directly to you, and then they email you, and then you email them back to say, and they say, I'm interested in your survey. I go, okay, that's great. Then you have a canned specific email back to them. Hi, I'm so-and-so. Thank you for considering participating or completing our survey. There's some information that I need to go over with you first before you make your decision to participate. So there's a number of chains or paths in which to recruit a participant and ask for their consent. Okay. So an example. So here is one from Here's one for, say, the Bala Cranberry Festival Visitor Experience Survey. To complete the survey online, please scan the QR code below using your cell phone or tablet camera. And that's just a bit of information. The survey is being managed by students from Georgian College Research Analyst Program. We thank you for taking the time to consider completing the survey. If you require additional information about the survey, please contact blah, blah, blah. If you wish to type in the URL using a web browser, please enter the following information. So in this one, it's a poster. The poster takes them directly to the survey, which then gets them to the consent piece. Right? If you're doing your survey this way, you need to have something that looks like this. So, welcome to the Bala Cranberry Festival Visitor Experience Survey. As interested in understanding the event's impact on the region. The third-party survey, thank you in advance for taking the time to consider completing the survey. This questionnaire should take no longer than 10 minutes to complete. Participation is voluntary, and you may withdraw at any time. So I'm covering all the elements of informed consent here, right? I'm saying who we are. I'm saying the purpose of the survey. Telling them how long the survey takes in terms of procedure. Their participation is completely voluntary, and they may withdraw at any time. Any personal information will be treated confidentially. Response will be reported back anonymously and as a portion of the total, so no individual data. They also have the option to enter a draw for a prize, which is 2 passengers for a Parry Sound tour. And there was some cranberry merchandise again. So our thanks for taking a few moments out of your busy day to consider responding to our questions. If you've decided to complete the survey, select yes, I will complete the survey. They click yes. Then this is all part of the online survey. Then they click yes, boom, it takes them to the first survey of the question. The first question of the survey. If they say no, it bumps them to the end and thanks them for taking the time. Or they can just kick out of the survey itself. So that's one path, right? So that's a path. You can also have the email system too, right? You can have and this is just a standard canned email. Hello, we are so-and-so from Georgian College's Research Analyst Program in partnership, blah, blah, blah. As part of our study, we are writing to invite you to participate in an online survey. It is voluntary to participate, and you may withdraw your participation before or while you're taking the survey. It should take no more longer than 10 minutes. This is a canned email that would go to each person who answered an advertisement and sent an email to you. Or it was sent, in this case, the email was provided by the client organization. These are just caps and square brackets, so you have to fill that in. Okay. To access the survey, they click the link. And that link takes them to the survey where they're asked to, and then the consent kicks in, right? The full consent like you saw before in the other example. Okay? So that's what you have to do for consent. So I ask that you review the documents and have a good understanding of what you need to do to ensure that if you're asking and when you're recruiting participants for your survey, that you cover all the key elements of informed consent. The next thing to consider is protection of privacy and confidentiality. Now, you can have your survey can be anonymous, but one thing that's important is data security. How secure is the data that you're holding electronically in terms of your survey data? So you may have SPSS files, you may have download the survey data, you may have had some open-ended questions where the person may have given information. You may have had them ask if they're interested in participating in it, being part of a draw for a prize for having been part of the survey. Now, for a prize, they don't have to complete the survey. All they have to do is start the survey. They can quit it immediately. They are still eligible eligible for the draw. That's critically important. You can't force people to complete the survey to be eligible for the draw. That's just a little aside. We have to be really careful in terms of survey data. And some survey providers are U.S. companies like SurveyMonkey. And the other problem is, although the company is owned in the United States, and anything in the United States is under U.S. jurisdiction, the servers that hold the actual online survey data could be in a third country. So you could be a Canadian participant out of Georgian College, and you are completing a survey that is owned by, say, SurveyMonkey or Survey Hero, and which are two U.S. companies. Actually, Survey Hero is not a U.S. company. Take it back. But it's like with SurveyMonkey, and then the data is actually stored in another country. So the laws that you're governed by are U.S. laws for the collection of information as according to U.S. law, and also for where the data is physically stored, which is going to be becoming more iffy anyway because it's all cloud-based. Where the data is stored, you're also governed by the laws of the country where the data is stored. Okay. So, for example, things to consider. This is Question Pro. It's one of the, we've used this product before. And it says here, in certain situations, Question Pro may be required to disclose personal data in response to lawful requests by public authorities, including to meet national security or law enforcement requirements. We reserve the right to disclose your personally identifiable information as required by law, and when we believe that disclosure is necessary to protect our rights or to comply with a judicial proceeding, court order, or similar legal process. If Question Pro is involved in a merger, acquisition, or sale of all or a portion of its assets, you will be notified via email and or a prominent notice on our webpage of any change in ownership or uses of your personally identifiable information, as well as any choices you may have regarding personally identifiable information. So what they're saying is, Homeland Security States could come in with a court order for access to data about you, and they have to give it. If the company changes ownership and the company changes its privacy policies in terms of protection of privacy, that could change. They'll let you know, and they'll try their best to help you out in some sense. So you have to be very careful in terms of what product you use for online surveys. We were using Survey Hero, which was good because it was actually based in Switzerland, which follows the European Union, EU, standards, which are much more stringent than data standards in the United States, or actually even Canada's not too bad. Okay. When this is not so much for you for this course, but it's something to be mindful of when you're for ethics approval. Data storage and data transportation. Don't want data flying around on emails or cloud drivers or such. The best option we've had so far is to ensure that data is stored on encrypted flash drives. So you can have an encrypted flash drive, and our standard thus far is that encryption has to be compliant with the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation for Encryption, so the GDPR. And Kingston data flash drives, USB flash drives, most of them meet that requirement. So if you're downloading data and you're transporting data, then the requirement is that data be stored on an encrypted flash drive. It can also, getting a bit iffy, you'll oftentimes have to save it on a protected, password protected or drive on on your personal computer, for example. If you're dealing with any paper, any surveys that are collected on using a paper form, you have to ensure that when you store it, it's stored in a locked cabinet, and if you're when you get rid of it, you have to double shred it, so it's got to be shredded on the diagonals to ensure that no one could actually tape it together. Not that that would really ever happen, but it is a standard that we're required to meet. Okay, so that ends the video on ethics. I ask that you go through the documents. I ask that you be very aware of what the requirements are in terms of informed consent, in particular for surveys. You will have to write these scripts. If you're sending an email out to potential respondents, if you're doing intercepts, if you're doing a poster, you have to cover your bases, and you have to document that for me in your survey submission for this course. And it'll be formed if you're full-time, you'll include this in your research proposal. I have an assignment for you. Let me pull it up. And what I want you to do for the assignment, and it's assignment 5. This is a example email script to recruit for a survey, and also there is on the second page the informed consent that was at the start of the survey when the person accessed the survey from the online survey design provider like Question Pro, Survey Hero. And what I want you to do is I want you to read the script, and I want you to read the informed consent, and I want you to critique it. So I want you critique the work regarding the elements of informed consent that must be covered, noting what was correctly included, what was included but not correctly covered, and what was missing and should have been in either the email or the consent form. Place your comments in an MS Word document and upload it to Blackboard. So you're to use the examples. So for here, like the email, which covers elements of consent, you can fully cover the elements of consent here, but what you need to do is ensure that you cover, again, the elements of consent in the actual survey itself at the start. Okay.